You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 111. A devoted maid renders a final service and accompanies her mistress to the great void. A villainous slave takes his revenge and betrays his masters into the hands of thieves. Patience hurried forward, and with the help of another maid she raised Xueqin from the ground and gently escorted her to her room. There she laid her down with great care on the Kong, and told Crimson to bring a cup of hot water and hold it to her lips. Xueqin drank a sip of the water, and then sank into a heavy sleep. Autumn came briefly into the room, glanced at her lying there, and walked out again. Patience did not ask her to stay, but turned instead to Felicity, who was standing at her side, and said, "Go and tell their ladyships at once." Felicity informed Ladies Xing and Wang that Xueqin had vomited blood and would be unable to continue with her duties. Lady Xing suspected Xueqin of malingering, but refrained from expressing her suspicions in front of her female relatives. "Tell Mrs. Lien to go and lie down then," she said. No one made any further comment. That evening an endless stream of family and friends came to call, and only thanks to the help of a few close relations could a semblance of normality be maintained. Xueqin's absence was the cue for many of the staff to give up working altogether, and little now stood between Ronghua House and total chaos. At 10 o'clock in the evening, when those guests who lived a long way off had departed, the family began to prepare for the wake, and a chorus of lamentation rose from the womenfolk gathered within the funeral screen. Faithful wept herself into a faint, and had to be propped up and given a vigorous pummeling. When she came round, all she could say was, "Her old ladyship was always so good to me. I want to go with her." Her words were not taken seriously, but were considered a natural, if rather hyperbolic, expression of her grief. Later, when the time came for the wake proper, and over 100 family and servants were gathered together for the ritual, Faithful was nowhere to be seen, and in the general flurry of activity no one bothered to check where she was. The turn came for Amber and Grandmother Jia's other maids to lament and make their offering, and they would have looked for Faithful then to join them, but thought she had probably worn herself out with weeping and gone to lie down somewhere, and decided to let her be. When the ritual was over, Jiaxing told Jiao Lian to ensure that all was ready for the funeral cortege, and discussed with him who was to look after the house in the family's absence. "I've told Yun to stay at home and take charge," said Jiao Lian. "And Steward Lin and his family will stay behind as well and supervise the dismantling of the awning. I still don't know which of the ladies should be left in charge of the inner apartments." "I heard your mother say that Xueqin was ill and wouldn't be going," replied Jiaxing. "So she will be staying at home anyway. And Cousin Jin's wife suggested that, as she is so seriously ill, Xueqin should have Xichun and a few maids and serving women to keep her company. Between them they can keep an eye on grandmother's apartments." Jiao Lian had his reservations about this proposal. "Yu sure doesn't like Xichun," he thought to himself, "and is deliberately preventing her from going on the procession. But Xichun can't take charge on her own. And Xueqin is too sick to be of any help. You should go and rest now, uncle," he said to Jiaxing. "I'll report back to you when I've had a word with mother." Jiaxing nodded, and Jiao Lian went into Lady Xing's apartment. Earlier in the evening, Faithful had wandered off on her own, brooding tearfully to herself. "All my life I've lived with her old ladyship, and now that she's dead I've nowhere to turn. Sir, she is not at home, that's something to be thankful for, but I don't like the way Lady Xing is behaving. Sir Xing will never intervene on my behalf, and one way or another the future looks very bleak. The young masters will all be trying to get their way. We shall each of us be dealt with as they think fit, some kept for their beds, some married to their page boys. Well, I for one won't stand for it. I'd rather die. But how? That's the question." She had made her way towards Grandmother Jia's inner room. From the threshold she detected a faint form in the dim lamplight within, a lady with a sash in her hand, poised as if in the very act of hanging herself from a beam. Faithful was not in the least frightened. "Who can this be?" she asked herself. Someone bent on the same course as myself, but with greater resolve. Who are you? She said aloud. We seem to have the same thought. Let us die together. There was no reply. Faithful walked a little closer, and could see now that it was not one of the maids from Grandmother Gia's apartment. She looked more carefully. A chill breeze blew past her, and the lady's form vanished into thin air. Faithful stood there for a moment longer in a daze, then walked back into the outer room, and sat down on the edge of the Kong, lost in thought. Suddenly she exclaimed. Of course. That's who it was. Mr. Rong's first wife, from Ningwa House. But she died long ago. What was she doing here? I suppose she must have come to fetch me. But why was she going through the motions of hanging herself? After a few moments' thought. That's it. She was showing me how. With this realization, the evil had entered the very marrow of her being, and her resolve was formed at last. She rose to her feet as if in a trance and went to her toilet box, opening it and weeping all the while. She took out the lock of hair that she had once cut from her head, and slipped it inside the bosom of her dress. She untied the sash from around her waist, and looped one end of it over the beam where Qin Keqing had just stood. Then she gave herself up to one last fit of weeping. Hearing the guests leave in the distance, and fearing that someone might come in and surprise her before the deed was done, she quickly pulled the door to and fetched a footstool. Standing on the stool, she tied a slipknot in the sash, put her head through the knot and kicked the stool away. Alas! The last breath was soon strangled from her throat, and her gentle soul fled its mortal frame. The wandering soul was still uncertain whither to proceed, when it saw once more the faint form of Qin Keqing standing before it. Mrs. Rong, it cried, advancing urgently towards the apparition. Wait for me. I am not Mrs. Rong, came the reply. I am Disenchantment's younger sister, Keqing. But you're most definitely Mrs. Rong, protested Faithful. How can you deny it? Listen, replied the other. I will tell you the true story of all this, and then you will surely understand. I once occupied the highest seat in Disenchantment's tribunal of love. My responsibility was the settlement of debts of passion. I went down into the human world, where naturally I was destined to become the world's foremost lover, my mission being to draw lovesick lads and lovelorn maidens with all speed back to the tribunal, and the settlement of their debts. As part of this mission it was my karma to hang myself. I have now seen through the illusion of mortal attachment, and have risen above the sea of passion to return to the paradise of love. This leaves a vacancy in the land of illusion, in the department of fond infatuation. You have been chosen by Disenchantment to take my place, and I have been sent to guide you there. But I am a most unpassionate person, protested Faithful. How can I be considered a lover? You don't understand, replied the other. Earthlings treat lust and love as one and the same thing. By this means they practice all manner of lechery and immorality, and pass it off as harmless romance. They do not understand the true meaning of the word love. Before the emotions of pleasure, anger, grief and joy stir within the human breast, there exists the natural state of love. The stirring of these emotions causes passion. Our kind of love, yours and mine, is the former, natural state. It is like a bud. Once open, it ceases to be true love. Faithful's soul signaled understanding with a nod, and followed Qin Keqing. When the wake was over, ladies Xing and Wang began giving instructions to those of the servants who were staying behind to look after the house, and Amber went in search of Faithful to ask her whether their carriages had been hired for the next day. She looked in vain in the outer room of Grandmother Gia's apartment, and then she noticed that the door to the inner room was on the latch, and putting her eye to the crack peered through into the half-lit interior. A flickering lamp filled the room with eerie shadows. No sound could be heard from inside, and she retraced her steps, saying to herself, "Where can the wretched girl have disappeared to?" On her way out she bumped into Pearl. "Have you seen Faithful?" she asked. "No," replied Pearl. "I've been looking myself. Their ladyships want to speak to her." Most probably she's fallen asleep in the inner room. I've just had a look, she didn't seem to be there, said Amber. The lamp needs trimming, and it's awfully dark and spooky inside. I didn't actually go inside. Shall we go in together and look properly? The two maids entered the room. First they trimmed the lamp. Who put this footstool here? Exclaimed Pearl. I nearly tripped over it. As she spoke she looked upwards and let out a horrified cry. Io! She fell back and collided with Amber, who looked up in turn, screamed and stood rooted to the spot. Their cries were soon heard, and other maids came running into the room. There were more shrieks of horror, and word was sent at once to Ladies Xing and Wang. When Lady Wang and Bao Chai heard the news, they both burst into tears and set off to Grandmother Jia's apartment to see for themselves. I never thought Faithful had it in her to do this, exclaimed Lady Xing. Send someone at once to inform Serjing. Bao Yu stood dumbfounded, an expression of glazed horror in his eyes. Aroma and his other maids rallied him. Cry if you must, but don't bottle it up like this. Finally he managed to emit a piercing wail. What a rare girl Faithful was to choose such a death, he had been thinking to himself. The purest essence of the universe is truly concentrated in her sex. She has found a fitting and noble death. We, grandmother's own grandchildren, are despicable by comparison. We have shown ourselves less devoted than her maid. He found something strangely comforting in this thought, and by the time Bao Chai had come to his side to soothe his tears, he was smiling again. Oh dear, cried Aroma. Mr. Bao's going mad again. It's nothing to worry about, Bao Chai reassured her. No doubt he has his reasons. Bao Yu was pleased to hear Bao Chai say this. Perhaps she really does understand me, he thought to himself. If so, she is the only one. He was drifting off into some other fantastic reverie when Jiajing arrived. Faithful is a commendable child, exclaimed Jiajing with a sincere sigh of admiration. Lady Jia's love for her was not in vain. He turned to Jiao Yan. Send someone to buy her a coffin, and lay her in it this very night. Tomorrow her remains can be conveyed together with mother's, and her coffin can lie in state behind that of her mistress. In this way her noble act can be carried to a fitting conclusion. Jiao Yan went out to execute these instructions, and gave orders for Faithful's body to be let down, and laid out in Grandmother Jia's inner room. When Patience heard the news of Faithful's suicide, she came with Oriole, and a whole crowd of other maids, and they all wept bitterly before Faithful's body. The occasion caused Nightingale to think of her own future, and the precariousness of her present situation, and she regretted that she herself had not chosen Faithful's path, and followed Dayu to the grave. By so doing she would at least have fulfilled her duty as a maid and died a noble death. In Bao Yu's apartment she was doing little more than marking time. Although he was very considerate and affectionate towards her, she knew that nothing would ever come of it. All these thoughts added a note of personal grief to her lamentations. Lady Wang sent at once for Faithful's sister-in-law. She told her to supervise the encoffinment, and after consulting with Lady Xing, issued her an allowance of 100 taels from Grandmother Jia's fund. She also promised to sort out all Faithful's private effects, and give them to her as soon as she had time. The sister-in-law kowtowed, and so far from exhibiting any signs of grief, seemed rather pleased. What wonderful courage Faithful showed, she exclaimed. And what a lucky girl she is, to have won such glory, and such a splendid funeral into the bargain. One of the serving women nearby rebuked her. That's quite enough from you. 100 taels is a poor bargain for your own sister-in-law's life. Think how much more profit you'd have made out of her if you'd only managed to flog her earlier on to Cerci. Then you'd have had something to crow about. The words struck home, and Faithful's sister-in-law departed blushing. At the inner gate she met Steward Lin with a team of men carrying in the coffin, and returned with them, helping them lay Faithful's corpse in the coffin, and herself putting on a show of mourning. Since Faithful had died in the best Confucian tradition, Out of devotion to her mistress, Jiajing sent for incense and himself lit 3 joss sticks before her coffin. For her loyalty and devotion, he said, having made a solemn bow, she deserves to be elevated above the rank of a mere maid. The younger generation must pay homage to her. Bao Yu's delight knew no bounds. He came forward and with almost exaggerated reverence performed a series of full-blown kowtows. Jiao Yan also recalled Faithful's past kindnesses to him, and would have followed suit, but Lady Xing restrained him. One of the masters is quite enough. Too much of this might ruin her chances of being born again. Jiao Yan desisted. But Bao Chai felt uneasy at Lady Xing's words. Strictly speaking, I shouldn't kowtow to her, she said. But this is a special case. We are all of us too bound by our commitments to the living to give in to any extreme display of grief. But Faithful has acted for us. She has given the fullest expression to our devotion, and now we should ask her to continue serving grandmother in the next world on our behalf. That would at least be a small token of our love. She walked forward on Oriol's arm and poured a libation of wine before Faithful's coffin, the tears streaming in profusion down her cheeks. When the libation was completed, she kowtowed several times in succession, and sobbed emotionally. Some of the assembled company commented wryly that now Bao Yu and his wife were both demented, others protested that their conduct evinced a sincere grief, while some restricted themselves to observing that they had at least manifested a sense of what was right and proper. Jia Zheng, for his part, was pleased with them. He had by now settled the caretaking arrangements, and it was agreed that Shi Feng and Shi Chun would stay behind, while all the other ladies would take part in the procession. No one slept a great deal that night. At 4 in the morning, the cortege could be heard gathering outside, and by 7 it was ready to move off, with Jia Zheng at the head, in full mourning attire, and weeping profusely, as the rites demanded of a filial son. The street was lined with the funeral booths of countless families, which need not be described in detail here. At last they reached the temple of the Iron Threshold, and the coffins were set out, while the menfolk in mourning prepared to spend the night at the temple. At home, Steward Lin supervised the dismantling of the funeral awning, carefully bolted the doors, and put up the shutters on the windows, swept the courtyard, and appointed wardens for the night watch, to commence their duties that evening. It was a well-established rule at Ronghua House that the innermost gate was closed at 10, and after that hour entrance to the inner apartments was strictly forbidden to males. Female domestics kept the watch inside. Shi Feng, despite a night's rest, had still not recovered from her attack, and although she seemed a little more composed, she was certainly not capable of getting about. Patience and Shi Chun therefore undertook a tour of inspection, and gave the women on night watch their instructions before retiring to their separate apartments. Our narrative turns at this point to Zhou Rui's foster son, He-san, who, it may be remembered, had been flogged and expelled from Ronghua House by Cousin Jin the previous year for fighting with his fellow servant, Bao Er, and had since then spent most of his time in the gambling dens. With grandmother Jia's death, He-san thought there might be a possibility of reinstatement, or at least a job of some kind in the offing for him, and he made inquiries at Ronghua House several days in succession. Finally it became clear that he was engaged on a futile quest, and heaving many a disgruntled sigh he made his way back to one of his usual haunts, and slumped into a chair. His cronies noticed his depressed air and called out to him. "San, old mate, why not have another fling? Who knows, your luck might turn." "I'd love to," exclaimed He-san bitterly. "But I haven't a penny left to play with." "Come off it. After all the time you've been away at your old Pajot's place? You must have fixed yourself up all right. Don't come the beggar on us." "That's what you think. Oh, they've got plenty, millions in fact, but they're keeping it all tucked away. They won't spend it. They'll hang on to it, and in the end it will take a fire, or a thief to make them let go. You can't expect us to believe they're that rich, after what they had confiscated in that raid." "You don't realize," replied He-san. "It was only what they couldn't hide that got taken. The old lady left behind a stash of her own when she died, and they won't part with a penny of it. It's all put away in her room. They're going to decide what to do with it after the funeral. These words seemed to make a particularly strong impression on one member of the company, who exclaimed after a few more throws of the dice. All I ever do is lose. I'll never break even. I'm off to bed. As he walked out, he took San to one side and muttered. A word, old San. San followed him out. I can't bear watching a clever fella like you go skint when there's no need. It's my luck, muttered San. What can I do about it? I thought just now you said Rongwa House was stacked with money. Why not get some of it for yourself? Wait a minute, rejoined San. It may be stacked with money, but that doesn't mean they'd give us a penny of it. The man laughed. Well, if they won't give it away, why don't we just help ourselves? San began to catch his drift. And just how do you propose to do that? He asked. Oh, show some guts, man. Don't be so feeble, was the reply. I'd have got my fingers on it long ago. What sort of guts have you got then? The man's voice dropped to a whisper. If you want to make a lot of money out of this, all you have to do is show us the way in. I've got some friends in this line of business, first-class operators. They're just the ones for this job. And it so happens the Jias are all away at this funeral, and there's only a few women left at home. Mind you, a whole garrison of men wouldn't scare my friends. But maybe you're scared? Me, objected San hotly. I'm not scared. Do you think I'm worried about old Joe? Why, I only let him be my foster dad, because his missus asked me to. He's nothing. But it all sounds a bit dodgy to me. Could land us in a lot of trouble. The Jias have got connections with every yamen. Supposing we do manage to get the stuff out, it'll be hard to get rid of it. This time you're in luck, old friend, said the other. Some of my seafaring mates happen to be in the area at this very moment, waiting for a job like this to crop up. Once we've got our hands on the money, you and I would be wasting our time in these parts. We'd be far better off going to sea with my mates and spending our fortune there. Good idea, eh? Of course, if you can't bear the thought of parting from your old foster mum, we'll just have to lug her along too. One big happy family, eh? You're drunk, exclaimed San. You don't know what you're talking about. The whole idea's a crazy one. Nonetheless, he took the man aside into an out-of-the-way alley, and the two of them stood there talking a while longer before going their separate ways. Our story must leave them for the time being. We must return to Rongwa House and to Bao Yong, the Formersian family retainer now living with the Jias, who after a dressing down from Jiajing had been demoted to caretaking duties in the garden. In the general bustle of Grandmother Jia's funeral, no one thought of assigning him a task. He was unconcerned by this and continued to mind his own business, cooking for himself and leading a somewhat carefree and independent life. If he felt bored, he would take a nap, and on waking would practice with sword and stave in the garden. On the day of Grandmother Jia's funeral procession, of which he was quite aware, although he had been given no part to play in it, he was taking a stroll in the garden when he saw the figure of a nun accompanied by an old matron, making their way to the side gate, where they began knocking. He went up to them. Where would you be going, Reverend Mother? The old matron replied. We heard that Lady Jia's wake is over, and as we couldn't see Miss Shichun in the procession, we thought she must have stayed at home. Sister thought she might be lonely, and has come to call on her. None of the family are at home, said Bao Yong. I'm in charge of the garden, and I must ask you to return to your quarters. If you want to visit, please wait until they have come back from the procession. And who do you think you are, you ruffian? The matron protested indignantly. What business is it of yours where we go? I don't like your type, replied Bao Yong. I say you can't go, and that's final. Why, this is downright mutiny, the old matron retorted angrily and noisily. When Lady Jia was alive they never stopped us going anywhere. What kind of an upstart are you, to start throwing your weight around in this insolent manner? I don't care what you say, I will go out this way. She seized the door knocker and struck it several times with all her might. Adamantina was speechless with rage as she listened to this exchange. She was on the point of going home, when the old women on the other side of the gate heard the sound of an argument, and opened up to investigate. Deducing that Adamantina must have been offended by Bao Yong, and knowing that she was on intimate terms with the ladies of the house, especially Miss Xichun, the women feared that at some later date she might report them for not letting her through, and thereby get them into serious trouble. They hurried after her. We had no idea you were here, Your Reverence. Our apologies for being so slow in opening the gate. Miss Xichun is at home, and would be so pleased to see you. Please come on in. That stupid caretaker is new here. He doesn't know anything. We'll report him later to her ladyship, and she'll have him beaten, and get rid of him. At first Adamantina refused to change her mind. But the old women kept on pestering her, begged her not to get them into trouble, were on the point of falling to their knees, until in the end she really had no choice but to turn back and follow them into the mansion. Bao Yong, seeing how things stood, understandably made no further attempts at obstruction, but went back to his room, scowling and fuming to himself. Adamantina went straight to Xichun's apartment. She offered her condolences, and they chatted for a while. I still have a few more nights to last out before the others come home, said Xichun. Shifeng is sick, and I'm all on my own. It's so boring and lonely, and scaring. If only I had someone to keep me company. Now that you've come all this way, won't you stay the night? Please. We could play Go together and chat. At first Adamantina was reluctant. But she felt sorry for Xichun, and then at the mention of the game Go her eyes lit up, and she agreed to stay, instructing the matron to return to the hermitage, and send one of the novices with her tea things, her clothes and her bedding. Xichun was delighted and for her part instructed Landscape to go and fetch some of the supply of the previous year's rainwater, which had been stored and put aside for making tea. She made a point of saying that Adamantina would not be needing a cup, as she had her own set. The novice presently arrived with Adamantina's things, Xichun made the tea, and the two of them were soon carried away in a spirited conversation that lasted until 8 o'clock in the evening, when Landscape laid out the Go board, and they settled down to play. Xichun lost the first 2 games, but then Adamantina gave her a handicap of 4, and she managed to win the next by half a point. Before they knew, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the night was breathlessly still. I must meditate at 4, said Adamantina. You go in now and rest. My own girl can wait on me. Xichun was reluctant to go, but complied out of respect for Adamantina's religious practice. She was about to go into her bedroom, when suddenly she heard a great cry coming from the women on night watch in Grandmother Jia's apartment, which was soon taken up by her own serving women. Help! Help! Someone has broken in. Xichun, Landscape and the other maids were scared out of their wits. Next they heard shouting coming from the men on night duty in the outer apartments. Dear oh dear, exclaimed Adamantina. There must be burglars in the house. She hurriedly closed the door of the room and covered her lamp. Peeping through a hole in the window, she could see several men standing in the courtyard outside. Speechless at first with terror, she turned and crept quietly back into the room, gesturing with her hands, and finally saying to the others, Heaven save us! What great burly fellows there are out there! As she spoke, there was a clatter on the rooftop above her head, and she heard the night watchman bursting into the courtyard with cries of Stop thief! Everything has been taken from Lady Jia's apartment. We must find the thief, called one of them. The others have already gone to the east wing. We'll search the west. One of Xichun's old women, hearing familiar voices, called out from inside. Some of them have climbed up on our roof. Look, cried the night watchman. There they are. Up there. A confused hubbub ensued, several tiles came hurtling down from the roof, and none of the watchmen had the courage to climb in pursuit. They were all standing there rather helplessly, when a fresh burst of noise came from the direction of the side gate to the garden, followed by the sound of the gate itself being broken down, and in stormed a great hefty fellow with a wooden club in his hand. They all tried to hide, without any success. "We must stop them all, every one of them," bellowed the new arrival. "Follow me." They stood there paralyzed with fear, while the club-wielding man continued to harangue them. One of the more perspicacious among them finally identified him as Bao Yong, and gradually the others regained their nerve and began saying shakily. "One of the thieves managed to escape altogether. But some of them are still up on the roof." The instant Bao Yong heard this, he vaulted up onto the roof and went in hot pursuit. After the main part of their mission was accomplished, the thieves, knowing how unprotected the Jiao mansion was, had been casually snooping around in Shichun's courtyard, and had caught a glimpse there of a very attractive young nun, which had put all sorts of mischievous ideas into their heads. They knew that the apartment was unguarded save by a handful of scared old women, and were about to kick the door in, and put an abrupt end to Adamantina's meditations when they heard the sound of footsteps coming from outside, and escaped onto the rooftop. They soon saw that they outnumbered their pursuers, and had decided to fight it out when a man leapt up onto the roof and came after them. He was on his own and they therefore moved into the attack with short swords, only to find themselves quickly outmatched. With a few powerful and deftly placed strokes of his club, Bao Yong had soon dispatched one of them off the roof, while the rest fled over the wall into the garden, where others of the gang had been stationed to receive the stolen goods. These now drew their swords in defense of the returning party, and seeing there was only one man following them, they closed in on him. "Petty thieves," stormed Bao Yong. "Do you dare to do battle with me?" "They knocked one of us down," exclaimed one of the gang. "He may not even be alive, but we'd better try to get him out." Bao Yong moved into the attack, and 4 or 5 of the thieves formed a ring around him, brandishing their swords in a confused melee, which finally broke up when some of the night watchmen plucked up enough courage to come to Bao Yong's aid, and the outnumbered thieves made good their escape. Bao Yong, still in hot pursuit, tripped over some unseen obstacle lying on the roof, and when he clambered to his feet, and saw that it was a chest, he deduced that the thieves had failed to take their loot with them, and therefore abandoned his pursuit. They must anyway be well ahead and beyond reach by now, he reflected. He told the servants to fetch lights. On closer inspection he discovered that there were several chests, and that they were all empty. He gave orders for them to be removed and himself headed back to the main apartment. His lack of familiarity with the layout of the mansion caused him to wander into Shifeng's apartment, where all the lights were ablaze. "Have the thieves been here?" he asked. "We haven't opened the doors," came Patience's trembling voice from within. "But we heard cries from the main apartments, you'd better go there." Bao Yong had no sense of direction, but he saw the other watchmen in the distance, and followed them to the main apartment, where he found doors and windows thrown open, and the women on night duty sobbing. Presently Jia Yun and Steward Lin arrived, appalled by the news of the burglary. They found Grandmother Jia's door wide open, and could see by the lamplight that the lock had been wrenched open, and the chests and cupboards inside had all been broken apart. There were curses for the women on night duty. "Are you all half dead? Didn't you even know there were thieves in the house?" "There's a roster for night duty," came the tearful reply, "and we're on second and third watches. We never stopped on our rounds, we checked front and back. The thieves came during the 4th and 5th watches, just after we finished duty. We heard the shouting, but couldn't see anyone, and when we came to look, the things had already gone. Please, sirs, question the 4th and 5th watch, not us." "You deserve to die, the lot of you," exclaimed Steward Linear. "I'll talk to you later. First I must inspect the rest of the house." The night watchman led him to Yusher's apartment, which was securely closed. They heard voices crying from within. "We nearly died of fright." "Has anything been taken from here?" asked Linear. The women finally opened the door. "No, we've had nothing stolen." Next Lin led his men to Shichun's, where again they heard voices inside. Lord save us. Miss Shichun's died of fright. Please wake up, miss. Lin told them to open up and asked them what had happened. An old woman appeared in the doorway. The thieves were fighting in our courtyard, and Miss Shichun was terribly frightened. Luckily Sister Adamantina and Miss Landscape have brought her round. We've had nothing stolen. What do you mean, fighting? Asked Lin. One of the watchmen replied. It was young Bao Yong who saved the day, sir. He climbed onto the roof and chased them away. And I heard one got knocked down. Yes, put in Bao Yong. The body's over by the garden gate. You'd better hurry over there and have a look. Jia Yun and company went to the garden gate, and sure enough there lying on the ground was the dead body of a man, which on closer inspection was found to resemble very closely Zhou Rui's adopted son He San. They were all greatly taken aback by this discovery. One man was left to stand guard over the body, and 2 were sent to keep a watch on the front and rear garden gates, which were both found to have their locks intact. Lin now gave orders to open the main gate and to report the burglary to the police. The police arrived straight away and began their investigation. The thieves, they concluded, had climbed up onto the rooftop from a back alley and had made their way across to Grandmother Jia's apartment, where broken tiles were found and more tracks leading straight to the garden at the rear. They were armed, cried all the servants on night duty. The police officer seemed somewhat put out by this. There is no evidence of torches or anything that would point to armed robbery. What grounds have you for this accusation? When we chased them, they started throwing tiles at us from the roof, and we couldn't get near them. But our Bao Yong managed to climb onto the roof, and he went after them and chased them as far as the garden, where a whole lot more of them were waiting, and put up a fight. But when they found they couldn't beat our Bao Yong, they fled. You see, exclaimed the officer. If they were really armed robbers, they would surely have been able to overpower a single opponent. Anyway, enough of that. Find out exactly what's been taken and provide us with an inventory. Then we can make a proper report on the matter. Jia Yun and the other men now went to the main apartment, where they found Shi Chun, and with her Shi Feng, who had dragged herself there despite her illness. Jia Yun inquired after Shi Feng's health, and greeted Shi Chun, and then they all set about the unenviable task of determining what was missing. With Faithful dead, and Amber, and the other maids away at the funeral, no one knew where to start. The stolen things were all Lady Jia's personal belongings, and had always been kept stored away under lock and key. They had never been properly inventoried. The chests and cupboards were full of so many different things, they said. And now they're all empty. The thieves must have had ample time to do their work. What were the women on night duty doing, for heaven's sake? Since the dead body was He San's, and since he is the adopted son of the Zhous, they were probably all in on it together. Shi Feng was livid with rage when she heard this. Tie up all the women concerned, she ordered, and hand them over to the police for questioning. There was a general outcry, pleas for mercy, women down on their knees begging. To learn what was done with them, and whether or not any of the stolen goods were found, please turn to the next chapter.